First of all, let me invite the panelists, if you would like to raise any questions with each other or comment on each other's presentations.
Okay.
Pei-chia?
I think in the last session, we mostly talked about the learning of technocrats or bureaucrats and government officials, and the circulation of cultural and knowledge. But in this session, we have touched upon some new dimensions, such as the formation of transnational network among NGOs and in the civil society, and also the cross-border movement of people and the consequence in terms of the hybridization of lifestyle, taste, and foods. I think when we consider this dimension, it kind of brings in a change of perspective when we consider the question, what can East Asian countries learn from each other? So instead of looking at the nation state as a given unit, now we see a growing expansion of transnational networks and movements. So my question is, what's the role of the technology, especially internet, in formulating this transnational network and transnational civil society in particular?
Professor Zhu? Professor Pop?
Yes, you mean internet. There's so many things, and so diverse field. But I think that among the young generation, I often hear that they have friends in Japan and China, and sometimes some of them have no experience to visit there, but they can make the friend by the internet, and also before if they have chance to visit there, before visiting, they try to check the something very attractive in those countries and try to visit there, and they're very sometimes upload the pictures and something they got from those countries after traveling. So I think the internet is very the useful tool. As the broaden the network and the experience, even to spread their experience to the other peoples in the countries. And among the scholars also it's due to the internet we could have the more the knowledge and the more the things without the direct contact, and the internet is very the important tool for the globalizing the East Asia, I think. But that's very the general comment. But I don't know.
Professor?
Yeah. To my observation, I think the learning is, for example, international process. Will hardly just disclose in a way very, very productive and very, I think, constructive. For example, so if we look at the extent of the massive social flowing among Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, it's unbelievably huge and I think the extensive. But if we look at some sort of such a nationalistic sentiments among three countries, I think it's remained very, very firing up. It's still very, very strong. So then social contacts could narrow some sort of misunderstanding, but not necessarily just lay out the ground to make the people lower some sort of their contentious or even contending with, say, the national identity. That's what is happening in East Asia. So then my view is that how to unfolding the learning process, it's not just tackling some sort of, we say, diminishing the misunderstanding. It should become a leading engine in the political domain, making or tightening up the politician to recognize such a social, we say, infusion could just, not just touch on some sort of their feeling, but also help rebuild some sort of domestic political discourse. That's a very requested. For example, why Chinese young people still very emotional to Japan? If they turn on the TV channels in the evening, there's full of anti-Japan's war TV comedies. So then I think it's truly unhealthy for the Chinese young guys to recognize what today's Japan is. Then I think for the Japanese, if they always heard a lot of political debate about how bad non-democratic China is, I think that also will just produce a lot of China bias. For example, Abe is very strong and passionate, praising for value-based diplomacy. It also just increasing the alienation to China. Then Korean and the Chinese. I think one of the alienating factors is Goguryeo issues. I think it's a historical dynamics. Then Chinese say, some Chinese historians say it's belong to China. Then Koreans say it's belong to Korean. Then there is a huge irritation between some sort of, we say, historical arguments. So then my view is that learning is important, but the social contact will hardly touch on some sort of in-depth of the misunderstanding. We need a political aspiration, we need a political vision to get things changed.
I have a question to
Sure, please.
I think that the many things that I can learn from you, but you said about the Confucian culture in China, and the Chinese they're willing to learn from the Korea and the Japan and their experiences. But actually, why do you think that the Koreans and Japanese they are thinking that the Chinese does not learn anything, and they doesn't want to learn anything from the China and the Korea and Japan? Their perception. Why do you think?
Can I respond?
Please.
Yes, I think on surface, such a learning factor maybe is a little bit difficult to identify. For example, China always follow our way to political systemic, the proceeding. So we're very, very lag behind the East Asia's democratization movement. Even look at the economy. China is a state capitalism rather than market-driven capitalism. But I have to say, if we get into some sort of details of the Chinese social and economic evolutions, I see a lot of such a learning. For example, I can give you the two cases. One is it's not such a cultural fusion, but also we learn a lot from Japanese and the Korean. I think so far the Japan is a shining example for China to follow up in the modernization. The case is how to dividing the rubbish. So the Japan's exercise unbelievably excellent. So they usually the garbage bin could be divided into the different categories, different containers. Then someone is renewable, someone is buried and burning. So then I think in the past couple of years we use that such a system. So we consider Japan's exercise could be completely applicable or applied to the Chinese exercise. Then Korean. I think Korean food usually is less oily and very fresh. So then Korean food now is very hot cuisine in Beijing and even now in the coastal area. So increasing number of Chinese like Korean food, less oily, fresh, full of vegetables. So then I think the Chinese food also just improved. Traditionally, if the friends come, the Chinese traditional way to show hospitality is order a lot and then get to the table full. But such a sense now is truly dropping. So then I think such a cultural fusions at a regional level could help each other in a way very robust. But what my concern is, if we look at such a social and economic nuance change, yes, it's always on. But politically, how to just translate such a learning process into a more reciprocal process, it's still an unanswered question.
Thank you. We'll open to the audience. Lili Feng first.
Thanks for your question.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the roundtable sessions today. I have a question to ask Professor Lan. You just mentioned that the convergence and divergence of the immigrant policies in Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. And what I'm interested in is that which factors result in the divergence of these different countries or areas? I noticed that you mentioned something like past dependence. Would you please say something more in more detail about it? Thank you.
Should I respond?
Yeah, why don't you respond?
I think I talk about this in conclusion, like individual society, even though they face similar challenges and they are under reciprocal influence from the neighboring country. However, because they have very distinct social dynamics and also different histories. For example, in Japan's case, because there has been a big number of Koreans who are permanent residents but not citizens in Japan, even though many of them were actually born in Japan. So they have developed a very strong activism to fight for their rights on the local and community level. So when the new immigrants came in, the marriage migrant, the Filipino maids, they just mobilized the existing networks. So that's what I mean, historical dependence, because the new, what you do now is actually based on what happens in the past. And also that's the same thing with Korea case, because the strong labor movements, so the migrant workers' activism can actually build on the previous institutional network of local unions and local working movement, and that's not the case in Taiwan.
Professor Zhu?
Thank you, and I'm very appreciate for your talks. I found a very important keyword, socialization. Almost every scholar mentioned it, because such as ethnical, cultural, some kind of similarity or movement, social movements, and NGOs, and also this is socialization. But in policy learning literature, there's basically two mechanisms. First is socialization. The other is competition. For example, competition for high-end or shortage latent or labors. They will compete they will compete for these labors, and they will release similar policies to compete this high level talent. So this is convergence of the policy. And also another competition mechanism is competition for development model or ideology, just Professor Zhu Feng mentioned. This will result in divergence of the policies. So my question is, maybe lots of policy learning will be driven by two mechanisms, socialization and competition. But we can maybe identify these two mechanisms. So can we identify these mechanisms empirically, or maybe give some example? Thank you.
Should we take some other questions from the audience and then we'll turn back? Sebastian?
I'd like to deepen this point, actually, to sharpen it a little bit, say something challenging here. The underlying assumption of this panel seems to be that more exchange, more migration, more pop culture dissemination leads to more peace. To friendly relations, but this is clearly not the case, and I would really try to separate that very clearly. It was kind of an underlining assumption. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I think the experience in Europe is quite. We are talking about European subjects here, actually. Yeah, it's exchanges, integration, and all these pop cultures and economic integration, political integration. But I tell you that the bad experience that we are going through presently is that within just one crisis, actually, is blowing away many things that we have taken for granted before that. And this was based on really intensive integration, intensive exchanges, including migration, including marriage across borders, including all the food and pop culture, including economic recipes and market integration even. So the problem with this approach is that learning can, and I will want to strengthen this point here made by Zhu Xufeng, can actually lead to rivalry. And this is something that I see presently. It's not moving into the peaceful and harmonious direction. Even learning from others can mean to supersede them, to overcome their influence. And this is maybe a dynamic that we should take very seriously presently. So learning and exchange, even intensive exchange, does not necessarily lead to more harmonious, more peaceful relations in East Asia. And that's what I want to stress here based on our recent European experience. I'm surprised myself how fast this can change, actually. Yeah. And this was really deeply integrated and deeply harmonious, I would say, even harmonized in many ways, and socially embedded in all these things. It's you can lose it rapidly, actually. Yeah.
To pick up on that point myself, in the area of popular protest, which was a theme that sort of emerged a little bit in each of these three papers, there also has been a lot of diffusion or mutual learning, certainly. But, these days that mutual imitation seems to be creating ever more competitive forms of nationalistic protests. If one looks back to the 1960s, people misunderstood what popular protest in China meant, perhaps. But people emulated Red Guard movements and so on around the world. If you think about the 1970s and the Korean labor movement and its strong influence on democratization in Taiwan, for example, a kind of mutual learning of a certain sort of popular protest. These days also a great deal of emulation from one country to another across East Asia, but in ways that seem to be increasing hostilities rather than a kind of learning that most of us probably would think is leading to a more liberalized or more harmonious kind of international environment. So I'd be interested also in your comments on popular protest and the extent to which you think it is creating, you mentioned transnational activism and so on. We look at that increasingly vis-a-vis popular protest, but it seems to me, although we have transnational environmental movements, transnational peace movements, and so on, we also have a kind of transnational competition in popular protest that seems currently particularly intense in East Asia. One can even think of very sort of passive kinds of protest repertoires, such as suicide. Actually, it was a Taylor suicide that in many ways got the Korean labor movement started. We saw a huge rash of suicides at Foxconn in China not very long ago. Today we see, over 100 suicides in Tibet going on. And yet, that kind of emulation of protest techniques and so forth seems, in fact, to be creating increasing tension, not defusing it. So it's just to sort of follow up on this question of what exactly is being learned and whether it also can't have an intensification of hostilities and competition. Yes, Songbing and then Carter.
I have a question to what Professor Zhu Jun. I actually agree your argument completely. But now, when I think of this difference between this Eastern Asia country, I think one important difference is that among Korea, South Korea, and Japan, they already have built a healthy civil society. So this is what Chinese lack. I would like to have your idea. Do you see any possibility for Chinese, the government, to learn from this perspective? That means to give certain space for society to build up healthy civil society. The second question is that we all agree that Chinese government should change ideology. But problem is that this is a foundation for Communist Party to maintain on the power. So we have, this hope, but the question really is that without the pushing, this hope never be fulfilled. So that is what I mean. Civil society has to be built up and has to progress strongly, and then we have a foundation to talk about to change ideology.
Carter?
Actually, this is following up on your question, but also the point that you just made. As a historian of Korea, I can't help but be struck by what China did not learn, or maybe learned very well, by looking at popular protest in Korea in the 1980s, which actually has a longer history than the 1980s. It goes back to the 70s and the 60s, so there is a long history. And one of the distinctive things about it is that there were a series of Tiananmen Square incidents. I mean, you had one in 1960, you had another one in 1965, you had smaller but nevertheless significant kinds of crackdowns in the 1970s, and then of course in the 1980s as well. And yet each time the student population, the younger generation, almost two generations if you will, kept coming back into the streets and remained politicized, remained radicalized in a sense. If you look at China, after Tiananmen, there seems to have been a de-radicalization of the generation, and maybe two generations. And I'm just very interested in this difference and how it might be explained. And I may be wrong, but anecdotally, talking with young Chinese scholars and businessmen, I often get the sense that politics is not that interesting. Making money, succeeding, globalization, all these things, traveling the world, learning about the world, that's interesting. But politics, which was the central core of at least two generations in South Korea, is really not so significant.
Well, one other thing the Chinese did learn from the South Koreans is to take their new universities and put them as far away from the city center as possible. So just as Seoul National moved up there to that beautiful hillside resort after the major student demonstrations, so you see university after university in China moving its campuses to places like the Suzhou Industrial Park and so forth, where you can put them all under one lock and key. So that's a little part of what's going on, I would say. Yeah, Bob?
Two questions, actually. When I hear Du Feng's analysis, it seems to be less about learning about other cultures and peoples, but more about learning about politics and the political experiences of other countries and how that political experience can be learned in managing China's own rise. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is a recurring issue in Chinese academia today, is how Chinese behavior can influence the others so that their policy, they will see China as benign and allow China's peaceful rise. Is there, when Chinese academics look through the political experience of other countries, is there a model? Is there a particular country that has certain experiences that China can learn from, rather than negative lessons, which unfortunately there are so many? Are there positive lessons? And so when China speaks about a new kind of great power relationship, is it sui generis? Is it unique, or is it something you learn from And just a quick question for pei-chia. You talked about single women coming to Taiwan and then that experience in marriage. But my understanding is there are a lot of cross-strait marriages of Taiwanese going to the mainland and marrying and then bringing their spouses back. In a comparative perspective, how does that differ in this treatment on Taiwan?
Any final questions from the audience? Yes.
And I have a question for Professor Drew. It's a very fascinating presentation. And I have a question that first maybe asked by professors that China is in the past more than 100 years, China has never stopped being a country to learning from others and in China modern history. And actually, and also a question about the China is just a doubt about the feasibility of the Chinese changes the political discourse on propaganda on young people. And the other is I want to know is that the China from itself as a learning country can really change its self-image in the international stage as too aggressive. Mm-hmm. And actually, we maybe come for international news that China too aggressive in Africa, but actually for Chinese themselves, one we get to know is China has been too weak for diplomatics, and I don't want to know that if there's learning to be more or less to a learner could actually change some Chinese image for international work. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to turn back to the panelists now, and you don't have to answer all these questions. Just answer the ones that are easy for you to answer and take a couple minutes, and then we'll have a reception where there'll be more opportunity to discuss these issues.
Okay, I will respond to Sebastian's questions. I think in East Asia and also many parts of the world right now, what we are seeing is actually two seemingly contradictory phenomena. Like on the one hand, there are growing expansion of transnational network and movement and so on. But on the other hand, the enhancement of national identity or nationalism, as Professor Zhu talked about in his answer earlier. So these two things seem contradictory, but actually, to me, it's actually constitutes each other in the real social process. For example, in the last 10 years, there has been growing networks and encounter between Taiwan and mainland China. However, the encounter often bring anxiety about identity. So it does not necessarily create a bigger China without confrontation or harmony. It's actually like more and more Taiwanese, when they have more encounter with Chinese people, they actually reinforce their identity as Taiwanese, or they feel they feel the need to mark the boundary even more. So that's a question to Sebastian, and also a question, the point about socialization. To me, I think this terms socialization or diffusion somewhat carried an implication of people sort of internalizing the idea as learning. But what I have heard from many different cases in today's workshops, actually people are selectively appropriating ideas and sometimes misleadingly interpreting some cultural elements. And in many cases, I think it is people are mobilizing these foreign cultural elements and interpret it in a way that fit in their own cultural format and help them to engage in local symbolic struggle. So I think that might be another way we can look at learning as a social political process with more intention and power struggle involved. Thank you, Professor Park.
Okay, with regard to the questions from the two, as the Professor Zhu Supong and Harman, actually yes, I can find so many kind of the sphere among the Koreans is because of the rising China, and there's it's very the extreme rightist as Japan, and the CEO and owner of Samsung, the Mr. Egon, he mentioned about the sandwiches. Korea is like the egg in sandwich. So the very small one in between two big countries. Of course, that's I think that the social discourse in South Korea. However, what I found in Korea these days is very impressive one is because the during some kind of dispute on the Dokdo and Takeshima issue in Korea, there's some very small activities and campaign that do not purchase the goods is made in Japan, but that would not spread and that would not be the socialized. And even during that kind of dispute, so many people still they enjoy the Japanese food and Japanese restaurant. Probably if that kind of thing happened in the 1980s and 1990s, probably have the very big the protest against the Japan. But now I found that it's very different the phenomena in Korea. Means that I think that we have some kind of socializing the process of the Japanese or the Chinese culture.
Professor Zhu?
Okay, so let me very, very briefly answering some questions. First of all, I think let me starting my answer from my Chinese colleague. I'm totally convinced China will be making a way for, how say, the rise of a civil society. Look at Japan, look at South China. That points make a great sense for me. So future China's democratization should just macro ground for such a strong introduction of social factors. Then, the Chinese, Japanese, Koreans were very hardworking, intelligent, and even self-disciplined. If the government could set free some sort of, social-based competition and I think the participation, then China's democratization will unbelievably, I think, promising. Then ideology. I think that China should change their ideology. It's a very pressing task force. I think now a lot of the factors to affect the China's international relations is some sort of domestic, obsolete, systematic innovation. So then we need to get such a domestic, systematic innovation just going as fast as we can. Otherwise, I think on the one hand, China is rising, on the other hand, China is still backward. So such a mismatch, I think, is a big factors we should have in mind in any explanation of the China's current foreign policy issues and problems. Learning is not just a single social process. Learning is just a part of a social life. Paralleling the learning is a very multi-dimension, I think, the social complexity. So if you look at China, I think the thing is, in the past more than 170 years, one is learning. It's a dominant factor to always pioneering the Chinese modernization. Another one is resistance. Then we also could find some sort of the Chinese comparative factors from Japan and Korean. To my understanding, Japan and Korea, and even Taiwan, are full heart follower to Western culture, but never expected China could acting that way. At the best, I think China is a cooperator. China will not as full heart, I think, the followers, because the size matters, history matters. So then that's why the China's modernization has proven to be more shaky, bumpy than our Asian neighbors. Such a trajectory will unfolding in the coming days. So resistance based on history and culture will never, I think, diminish with my country. Then last one I have to say, Bob raised a great point. I think, yes, Chinese academia usually perceive learning is, of course, very important, but learning is not only. Another is, if we look at the social interactions, then at the core is action and a reaction modality. If the Chinese kids learn very sincerely, what sort of nice return we can expect. So then such an action and reaction circle usually is also another way to drive up the learning process. So I hope that China could be in better position to learn, then such a learning China also could nicely return. Thanks.
I'd like to thank all the panelists very much for some very stimulating comments and invite all of you to join us upstairs for a reception to ask whatever questions you were not able to ask in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you.